Hello, everybody. Welcome to Chapter 14, Income and Poverty, second last chapter in the course. So in Chapter 14, we look at the difference between income distribution and wealth distribution. And you may recall that income is a so-called flow variable, whereas wealth is a so-called stock variable. And then we look at four factors affecting income distribution levels within society, and we look at two normative views regarding how income should be distributed within society. And then the final topic in this chapter, short chapter, is how poverty is defined, and several federal Canadian government initiatives to address poverty in Canada. Okay, so let's just move on. Oops. Okay, so income in a general sense is our means of consuming. It's our means of consuming and saving. It fuels our consumption and savings. And you recall that in classical economics, the return to the factors of production are land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurialism or risk-taking. And then the returns to that are wages, rent, interest, and profit. And so income can be made up of any one of those returns to the factors of production. So when we speak about the income distribution in society, we mean the cumulative distribution of income across the population, starting from lowest income families to highest income families. And kind of a handy way of looking at how income is distributed in society is through this so-called Lorenz curve, which is a kind of a graphical representation of income distribution. And we have an example of the Lorenz curve right here. So the Lorenz curve was developed by an American economist about 100 years ago, this Max Lorenz in 1905, as a way of describing income inequalities. So on the x-axis, we have the cumulative percentage of households, and on the y-axis, we have the cumulative percentage of income in a particular year, starting at the lowest, and going to the highest, starting at the lowest and going to the highest. And so if income were perfectly distributed in society, or equally distributed in society, then the income distribution would be described by this 45-degree line. So 50% of the households would have 50% of the income, 75% of the households would have 75%, 100%, 100%. And so any deviations from this 45-degree line is a measure of income inequality, and that's the Lorenz curve. It's a measure of income inequality, unequal income distribution. So in this little example here, we have 50% of the households, the bottom 50%, having only 28% of the income. Okay, so we have the actual Lorenz curve for Canada, and it's a comparison between 2 years. Oh, 3 years. I think it's only 2 years. So the dark blue line is 2004. The lighter blue line is 2009. This is not the 1979 line. I don't like the 1979 line is on this chart, actually. So we can see that we do have unequal distribution of income in Canada, because in 1989, for example, about 50% of the households had about 30% of the annual income, and 70% of the households had about 50% of the annual income. And things got worse between 1989 and 2004, because the Lorenz curve got even more wowed. So in 2004, 50% of the population had about 28% of the income, and so on. So we have some, so although this Lorenz curve is kind of a handy way of looking at how we might say that income is unequally distributed in Canada or in other countries, there are some criticisms of this Lorenz curve. And the first criticism, these are from page 362. The first criticism is the Lorenz curve only represents earned income, and it does not take into account any income we receive in kind form. So if we receive free health care, or if we receive free public education, or we produce products in our households, we make our own food, we do our own work and whatnot, the value of those things are not included in the Lorenz curve. So probably low-income people are probably better off than indicated by the Lorenz curve. So probably our society is not quite as well skewed as the Lorenz curve represents. And then another drawback of the Lorenz curve is that it does not account for differences in household sizes. So if you have a dual income family, both husband and wife are working, they might have higher income than a single income household, but it may be that the single income household is actually better off on a per capita basis than the larger household, just because the larger household has more wage earners. Okay, another drawback of the Lorenz curve is it does not account for differences in ages. As we'll see very shortly here, there's a life cycle of earnings that we tend to go through, and younger people tend to have lower incomes than older people because they're less experienced and they have less training. And that's not accounted for in this Lorenz curve. Okay, the Lorenz curve also ignores income taxes, and it also ignores unreported income. So if you're a drug smuggler or an arms smuggler, or you do work under the table, you're a contractor that does work under the table, then that income does not get factored into the Lorenz curve. And so again, perhaps income distribution in Canada, or income distribution in most societies, is perhaps not quite as skewed as the Lorenz curve indicates. So we have the Canadian Lorenz curve here from 2004, 2009, and I have the Lorenz curve for some other countries. And it's kind of interesting to see this just because it shows some great disparities. Get my slides in order here. Just a sec. Oh, there it is. Sorry. There it is right there. Okay, so we have the Lorenz curve for three countries. We have Denmark, which is yellow. Denmark's hard to see. Denmark is this little yellow line right between the red and the blue. It's hard to see. Anyways, here's our perfect income distribution line. Here's this 45-degree line. Doesn't look like 45 degrees, but it is. The chart's just stretched out. So that's the blue line. Then we have Denmark in 1997. It's right on the edge. It's right on the edge between the yellow and the blue and the red. And so we can see that there is some income inequality in Denmark. And then we have Hungary in 2002. So here's Hungary. We have Hungary's the red. So the blue is it should be Denmark. Anyways, Denmark in the first quintile of income, that's the lowest 20%. It's 8.3% of the households have 20% of the income. And in Hungary, it's 9.5%. In Hungary, the second quintile, so that's up to the 40% of households, 23% in Denmark versus 23.4% in Hungary, and so on. So Hungary and Denmark are fairly similar. And then we have Namibia, which is in Africa. And so we can see that in this country in Africa, the income distribution is quite a bit more skewed. So 80% of the population in Namibia only have 21% of the income in the country. So that means that the remaining, the wealthiest 20% have 79% of the income in that country. So that's quite skewed. I think we would all agree that that's quite skewed. Okay, so let's just move back. Oops. Okay. Okay, so the bottom line for the Lorenz curve is that even though it does give us a measure of unequal income distribution within society, it might not be the most accurate measure. Okay, so now this little description corresponds to a chart on page 363 in the book, 363, and it describes the income distribution in dollar terms. So it says that the lowest quintile, so the lowest quintile is the lowest 20% of the 20% of the population. That's quintile means a fifth. Lowest quintile between 1989 and 2007, the lowest quintile earnings stayed at about $10,000 per year, and the highest quintile, so that's the wealthiest 20%, the wealthiest 20%, their income increased from about $60,000 up to $80,000. And then the question is, why did the wealthiest segment of society have such a large increase in income, whereas the poorest 20% stayed fairly constant in constant dollar terms? So there's two explanations for this. One is that if you're affluent, you're more likely to own your house, and if the value of your real estate, the value of your homes increase, then that can contribute to your increase in wealth. And so if you're less affluent and maybe you're renting instead of owning, then you don't participate in any increase in the value of real estate that you stay in. Okay, and then the second factor is behind why the wealthiest 20% of the Canadian population had such a relatively large increase in annual income is the effect of dual income earners. So if during this period there was an increase in the number of dual income earners per family, and you're more likely to see that at the in the wealthier segment of the population than in the poor sector, and so you have kind of a double whammy there. You've got the increasing incomes from two wage earners rather than just one. Okay. So this chart shows how the level of low-income people during the period 2001 to 2007, I think this should say 2007, declined across the most demographics in Canada. So these are the percentage of people in so-called low-income LICO groups. We'll come to LICO groups in a bit here, but it's low-income groups, and there were fewer people in the low-income groups in all these different demographic sectors of Canadian society in 2007 versus 2001. So in 2007, about 5% of people aged 65 and over were low income, but in 2001 it was probably about 7%. And in the age 18 to 64 age group, in 2007 it was about 10%, whereas in 2001 it was about 12%. So we see this decrease in low-income families pretty well across the board between 2001 and 2007. Okay, so the final little part of this first section here deals with wealth distribution as opposed to income distribution. So we mentioned earlier that income is a flow variable, whereas wealth is a stock variable. So income is kind of like our income statements, and wealth is like our balance sheets. And capital, so wealth, which is capital, is anything that can generate future satisfaction to consumers. So if you own equipment, or if you have an investment in wealth, it generates returns down the road, and then we can use those returns to buy consumer goods. And ideally, our concept of wealth would include both tangible forms of wealth and intangible. And when we speak about intangible, that includes human capital, so training and education, human wealth. Okay, so just before we move on here, I'm just going to make a reference to two little videos, sort of supplementary videos that I've posted to Moodle this week. One deals with unequal income distribution in the United States, in the US. And the second deals with unequal wealth distribution in the world. And these videos are quite short. One's about 6 minutes, and one's about 3.5 minutes. And they're really quite fascinating, because they talk about the income levels and the wealth levels of the most affluent 1% of the world's population. And when we look at the world as a whole, we have this extremely skewed wealth distribution, where with the 1% owning a tremendous amount of the total wealth in the global society. And likewise, in income distribution in the United States, it's quite skewed. There's no doubt that it's fairly skewed in Canada, but probably not quite as skewed in Canada than it is in the United States. But anyways, these are quite interesting videos, quite short, very dramatic. But anyways, they're supplementary information. Okay, so let's move on. So our second little section talks about these 4 main factors that affect income level differences. So we know that we do have these, the Lorenz curve in Canada shows us that we do not have perfectly equally distributed wealth or income in Canada, but we have a skewed distribution of income. And now the question is, why? What are the factors that affect differences in income levels? So we have 4 factors, we have 4 main factors that the authors emphasize. Are these the only factors? Let's not answer that question. I think the answer is no, but these are significant factors. So one factor is the age of the person, because what we know is that our earnings in our lifetime vary by age. So we have this age earnings profile. So we have age on the bottom, annual earnings on the y-axis. So we can see that, there's no dollar values here, so it's just kind of a generalized concept, but as we can kind of intuitively figure out, when we're quite young, our earnings are probably fairly low, and as we grow older, they increase, and then they plateau at a point, and then they start to decline, and then they actually drop off after a point. So the reason our earnings are low when we're young is because we probably have low levels of experience, low levels of training, low levels of education, and so low levels of experience. So as we improve all of those factors, education, training, work experience, our earnings are going to increase correspondingly, and then it kind of plateaus around middle age as the physical health of workers starts to decline, so our physical strength starts to decline, or stamina starts to decline, and then it starts declining, and then once we retire, our work income, our employment income, drops to zero. Okay. So I think that graph is kind of intuitive. Okay, so the second factor that affects differences in earnings in our population is so-called marginal productivity. So remember what marginal productivity means. This is the earnings earned by the incremental worker to an employer. When the employer hires that extra worker, the employee creates a certain amount of output, marginal physical productivity, and remember the theory in chapter 13 about labor markets. The marginal revenue product for that incremental employee equals the marginal physical product multiplied by the price of the or the value of the output that the person produces. And in theory, in labor market theory that we saw in chapter 13, the optimal quantity of employees that the employer hires is a quantity corresponding to the point where marginal physical revenue equals marginal factor cost. Okay. So what this factor says is that people should expect to get paid what their marginal physical revenue turns out to be. And if we worked in perfectly competitive labor markets, and we were getting paid less than what our marginal physical revenue, or marginal product revenue, I should say, marginal product revenue was equal to, then we would change jobs. If we're not getting paid what we think we're worth, we would change jobs. However, what we know is that this doesn't necessarily happen in our economy because we don't necessarily have perfect information. It may be that we're not getting paid what our marginal product revenue is earning, but if we don't know there are better opportunities elsewhere, or we don't know where they are, then we're not going to be able to change jobs very easily. And secondly, our labor markets are not necessarily perfectly competitive either. So, I mean, this is a theory. It may not be true. Okay. So we have 4 factors that can affect the marginal productivity of workers. So one is sort of innate talent. This is talent that we're effectively born with. So this corresponds to our physical strength, our physical coordination, our mental alertness. And we all know that people differ in these sort of innate abilities, and some of these abilities make some people better suited for some work rather than others. So part of the difference in marginal productivity is due to innate abilities, or differences in innate abilities. Okay, so another contributing factor to differences in marginal productivity is differences in experience. So as we know intuitively, experienced workers perform work more efficiently than inexperienced workers, and the faster we learn, the faster our productivity increases. So we expect more productive people to earn more than less productive people or less experienced people. That kind of makes sense. Okay, another factor contributing to differences in marginal productivity is training. So training really means it's a formal version of experience and really equates to on the job training. And then the final factor that can contribute to differences in marginal productivity is investments in human capital, otherwise known as formal post-secondary education. So I have a little slide here that kind of verifies this. Let me just find it here. Oh, it's right here. Okay, so this is from the TD Bank actually, but it shows that labor market outcomes. So this is a measure of income on the bottom. This is a measure of income on the x-axis, I should write that down. So basically what it says is as our education increases, our unemployment rate declines. So, oops, let me just get a point here. Oops. Okay, so the lower educated we are, the relatively higher the level of our unemployment rate. So if we have less than high school, unemployment rate is about 16%. If we have high school or some post-secondary, unemployment rate is about 9%. And if we have completed post-secondary education, then our unemployment rate drops to about 6%. And our employment rate increases as our level of education increases. So if we have less than high school, our employment rate is about 34%. If we have high school or some post-secondary, about 62%, and some post-secondary, about 73%. And our labor force participation rate also increases as our education increases. So less than high school, labor force participation rate is about 40%. If we have high school or some post-secondary, our labor force participation rate is up to about 68%. And then, of course, complete some post-secondary, or complete post-secondary, our labor force participation rate increases to about 77%. So the better educated we are, the more formal training we have, the more we participate in the workforce, and no doubt our earnings are going to be higher than otherwise. Okay. Let's just go back. Okay, so our next major factor that can explain some differences in income level differences across Canada, this is 3 out of 4, is inheritance. So it kind of makes a bit of sense. I mean, if you win the genetic lottery and you inherit lots of money, then you probably have more income from your investments than if you did not inherit any money. So inheritance is a factor. However, studies have shown that inheritance only increases our income about 8%. So it's not significant, or not terribly significant in the big picture. And then the fourth factor is the presence of discrimination in the workforce or in the work field. So economic discrimination is when we have two workers having the same marginal revenue product but receiving different rates of pay due to some non-economic factor such as their race, gender, or age. Okay, so and the book mentions that there are some groups in society that have different levels of pay even after factoring in differences in productivity and education. And on page 368, it mentions that women generally receive or only earn about 70% of what men earn. And this is Canada. So I have some international stats here just to kind of see where Canada fits in the world picture. Let me just find it here. Where does Canada fit in the world picture? And we're kind of at the middle of the pack, actually. So this is income gap between women and men. So how much less do women earn than men? So we do have this gender gap in Canada. So here's in Canada, women earn about, almost 20% less than men. So this is 2010. So obviously we're not as, we have a greater difference in Canada between the genders than in Norway. In Norway, women earn only about 7% less than men. In Canada, it's about 20%. But we're not as extreme as Japan, where the difference is about 30%. Anyways, these are other Western countries. So we're kind of in the middle of the pack. But when we talk about differences in earning levels by gender, we should keep a couple things in mind. One is that women naturally bear children. Men don't. So when women bear children, they have to leave the workforce for some period of time. And especially so if a woman becomes a stay-at-home mom for any period of time, then it may be that she's receiving less experience in the workplace. And that may be one factor that contributes to reduced employment earnings. And then the other factor that we should bear in mind is, although the genders may earn different levels of pay in Canada, it's partially due to doing different types of work. I don't have the stats with me, but I strongly suspect that on average, men probably do a higher level of dangerous work than women. Not always, but I suspect there's a difference there. So if more men work in the mining industry, or more men work in the forestry industry, more men work in dealing with chemicals and heavy equipment in the oil and gas industry, and they do more dangerous work, then they're probably going to get paid more. And so that's another contributing factor to this difference in gender differences in income levels. Okay, so let's move back. Okay, so we're looking at these factors affecting income level differences. And there's this, I don't know if this is sociological or an economic doctrine called the so-called doctrine of comparable worth. And if we wanted to translate that into English, it's also known as pay equity. So pay equity means what the term implies. It means that both genders should receive the same rate of pay for doing jobs of the same skill and same levels of responsibility. And this doctrine of comparable worth, otherwise known as pay equity, this is a more common term. This is part of the legal system in Canada. So, for example, we're in Alberta. So in Alberta, we have the Alberta Human Rights Act. We have the Alberta Human Rights Act. The Human Rights Act. And the Alberta Human Rights Act says, Alberta Human Rights Act says equal pay, where employees of both sexes perform the same or substantially similar work for an employer in an establishment, or where so to be, the employer shall pay the employees at the same rate of pay. This is the employment or pay equity provision incorporated into the Human Rights Act of Alberta. And of course, other jurisdictions across Canada have similar forms of legislation. Okay. Next little section looks at two normative views of how society should distribute income amongst its members. Oops, sorry. That's right here, sorry. So remember normative economics versus positive economics. Positive economics is descriptive, whereas normative means prescriptive. Normative equals prescriptive. Correct. So normative says what we should do. So the book presents two different views of how income should be distributed in society. First is based on productivity, and second is based on equality. So the principle for this first one, income distribution based on productivity, the principle is basically to each according to his or her production. And so that means that rewards should be distributed in society based on people's merit, where merit is judged by the value of output deemed by society. So this this view is the capitalist view. Capitalist view. We should receive what we earn. We should receive what we're due. And this is different than the Marxist view or the communist view that people should be rewarded according to their need rather than according to their productivity. Okay, and then the second normative view of how income should be distributed in society, principle just effectively says that to each the same. So everyone in society should have the same level of income. So this is more of a theory than this in Canada. It's more of a theory than actual practice because there are some apparent shortcomings with an equal distribution of income. And the first issue with an equal distribution of income is that it doesn't account for differences in types of work that people do. So some jobs are more unpleasant to do than others. Some jobs are more dangerous to do than others. Some people work more hours than others. So if we have all these differences in work, that suggests that people should not be paid equally on an absolute basis, but that it should get paid reflective of those differences in danger, unpleasantness, or hours of work. And then the second drawback of paying everybody the same amount of money is that it would kill our incentive to undertake developing our skills and training. I mean, if we weren't going to get paid more for taking all this training, why would we take the training? So we sort of need to have that carrot out there to entice us to do this unpleasant training, and to motivate us. Okay. So the final section of this chapter looks at poverty and some federal programs in Canada that address poverty. So in the first section of this chapter, the explanations regarding the differences in income explained why people were bound to have lower income throughout their lives. So we have this topic of it's an age-old topic. It's probably been around since beginning of mankind. The topic is poverty. The issue is poverty. And so the question is, what is poverty? And secondly, what's wrong with poverty? Like, why is there something wrong with poverty? So what is poverty in general? So in general, poverty is a level of income that's so low that it prevents people from having a quote-unquote acceptable standard of living. And in Canada, we don't have any single absolute dollar value definition of poverty. But what we do have is a Stats Canada definition of poverty, which says it's a level of poverty that adjusts to the size of the family that we belong to. So it's a size-based family income, and if we have less than that amount of money, we're poor. But of course, Stats Canada doesn't call it poor; it calls it a low income cutoff level. So basically, it means it's a level of income. If you're below this low income cutoff level, Stats Canada doesn't say that you're poor. What they say is you live in quote unquote straightened circumstances. Straightened. It doesn't mean not crooked. It means poor. It means poor. So straightened circumstances it's just a fancy euphemism for being poor. Okay, so what are these income levels below which we're considered poor in Canada? So I have these. Second here. Okay, so I have them. These are from 2015. These are from Government of Canada. So if we in Canada, if we live in an urban center and we only have one member in our family, we're a single person, then our Our poverty level is about $23,861. If we have two people in our household, then if we have less than $29,706, then we're officially poor. We live in straitened circumstances. Three people less than 36.5, four people less than 44.3, and so on. So it's a family size adjusted LICO level, low income cutoff level. Okay, so that's what poverty is in Canada. It's kind of defined in this family size context. So my second part of the question is that if that's what poverty is, what's wrong with poverty? And the question is, the answer, what's wrong with poverty, it's probably the wrong question. The question isn't really, the relevant question isn't what's wrong with poverty, but it's probably what are the consequences of poverty. So what are the consequences of poverty? So I've got a little bit of a list here, and there's any number of these kind of lists. So this one that I'm going to show you is not necessarily the most definitive, but I think it captures the spirit of the thing. Oops. Okay, so what are some of the consequences of poverty? So we have 5 consequences of poverty, according to this little article that I dug up. So let me just move to orange. Okay, the effects of poverty. So poverty has a negative effect on people's quality of life, on the opportunities open to them, and on their ability to fully participate in society. And it can be difficult to break out of the cycle of poverty, so poor children are more likely to become poor adults. So first major negative consequence of poverty is if you're not earning enough money to cover the necessities of life, you're probably going to have to go out and borrow money, go into debt. And if you borrow money when you don't have a high-paying job, then you're probably going to pay a higher interest rate than you would pay than if you did have a good-paying job. So if you're poor and you borrow money, you're probably digging yourself further into the ground because you're paying a high interest rate. Okay, so what else? What's another consequence of poverty? Is low income levels. Low education levels. So growing from poverty can affect people's future. Children who grow up in poor families are more likely to leave school early and without qualifications and end up either unemployed or in low-paid jobs, which means people from low-income families are more likely to remain poor when they're older. So poverty is generally no fun. Okay, so what are some other consequences of poverty? Well, there's a strong correlation between poverty and our level of healthiness. So people who live in poverty are at greater risk for poor mental health and physical health. They get sick more often, and they die younger. So they have shorter lifespans than more affluent people. And then there's also an impact in our housing. So people in poverty are more likely to be dependent on the state, so the government, for their housing needs, whether it's through subsidized private rented accommodation or social housing. And there's a greater risk of living in substandard accommodation and of becoming homeless. So again, poverty has some undesirable consequences in the realm of our accommodations. And then finally, the way this author concludes is that there's also a social exclusion factor. So poverty can prevent people from participating as equals in society, from feeling part of their community, and from developing the requisite skills and talents of that non-poor people develop. So there's nothing wrong with poverty per se. It simply has some undesirable consequences to the life of the impoverished. Okay. So the federal government has several initiatives to address poverty in Canada, and their general approach is through transfer payment programs. So as we saw back in chapter, I can't remember, 12, 13, transfer payments are payments from the government to a recipient where the recipient does not have to provide any service of value to the government. So if you're unemployed, you receive unemployment benefits. If you're retired, you receive retirement benefits. If you're um, elderly, you receive some kind of old age pension. And so transfer payments include EI and old age pension payments. Okay. So we have 5 federal programs that the book looks at that the feds use to address poverty in Canada. So, so old age security. So we have 3 components of old age security. We have, sorry, we have 3 components of old age security. One is actually called old age security. So the amount that the recipient receives depends on how long the person's been a resident of Canada, and it's indexed to the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, and it's adjusted 4 times a year. And then we also have a guaranteed GIS, guaranteed income supplement, that's paid to seniors with little additional income. It's non-taxable. And there are different rates for married and unmarried recipients. And then finally, we also have a so-called spousal allowance. So a spousal allowance is paid to a member of a family where their sole source of income is old age security or guaranteed income supplement. So they don't have any other private savings or private pension plans, then you're eligible for this special allowance. Okay, so the second initiative of the federal government to address poverty, again, this one is addressed towards elderly people, is the Canada Pension Plan. And so the Canada Pension Plan, as we all know, when we're employees, both the employee and the employer contribute off their paycheck to the Canada Pension Plan, and then when we retire, we're entitled to draw down. So I have the rates. So in 2015, both the employee and the employer contributed 4.95% of our employment earnings to the Canada Pension Plan. And likewise, when we draw funds out of the Canada Pension Plan when we're retired, the amount that we receive is based on our original contributions, not on the basis of how much we need. Anyways, so both the employer and the employee contribute almost 5%. So it's effectively it's a payroll tax, is what it is. Okay, then the next one, the next federal program aimed at alleviating or addressing poverty in Canada is EI. So EI is also transfer payment. So again, in Canada, both the employer and the employee contribute to EI. And in 2015, the employee contribution is 1.88% of our earnings, and the employer's rate is 1.88 times 1.4. It's 140% higher than the employee contributions, so that's about 2.63% that the employer kicks in to EI. So to receive EI, of course, you have to be unemployed. And there's some incentives there to help people find works in other fields of employment other than the ones that they came out of. If there's structural changes in the economy and people need to change occupations, then there's some incentives there to help people shift occupations. Okay. Okay, then the 2 final ones are the child tax benefit. So it's a federal program aimed at helping families that have children, have younger children. This used to be called the baby bonus when I was a kid, and I think the rate is $112.33 a month for a child under the age of 18. And if you have more than one child, then there's an additional $7.83, or there's an additional $7.83 per extra child. And then finally, there's a universal child care benefit. So it's a federal program to help people afford daycare. Not terribly generous. But anyways, it's a bit of something. I think it's changing this election, but I can't remember. Okay, so the final slide for this chapter. It's a graph of this declining poverty rate in Canada over the last generation. So this is a chart of the percentage of people living in poverty. So this is the percentage of people living below the low-income cutoff level. So it's below these LICO levels. And we can see that there's been this long-term downward trend in Canada over the last generation. And so what we also know is that, the governments of Canada, provincial governments primarily, have welfare programs, otherwise known as social assistance, that they give to poor people. And we know that social assistance can act as a disincentive for people to search for work. And so the provinces have adjusted their social assistance programs so that if someone on social assistance earns some employment income, there's not a one-for-one cutback in the level of social assistance. So there's that incentive for people to move into the workforce. Okay. Then the final things I was going to show you here. So another way to show that our poverty level in Canada has been declining over recent years. First chart is decreases in the poverty levels by family type. So again, these are LICO families. These are LICO families. So if you're a married couple with no children, I mean, it's a little bit hard to see here, but there has been a bit of a long-term decrease. So in 2011, only about 5% coupled families without children were at the poverty level, and if we have two-parent families with children, there's also been a bit of a long-term downtrend. It's a little bit higher than families without children, but it's only about 6 or 7%. However, even though the poverty level is higher for single-parent families, there has still been this long-term downtrend over the last, or between the decade between 2001 and 2011. So even though about 20% of single-income families with a single-parent families, I should say, 20% of single-parent families live in poverty. That's down about a third from a decade earlier. And then the final slide. So this is Canada. This is Canada. So I have some international stats here, which sort of shows the same thing happening on the global basis. So over the last almost 200 years, there has been a long-term reduction in poverty levels throughout the world. So here's global share of the population living in poverty. So about 200 years ago, about 95% of the world's population lived in poverty, and today, in 2000 and about 2000, so about 15 years old, it's only about 50%. So it declined from 95% down to 50%, so it's quite a reduction. And the percentage of people living in so-called extreme poverty has declined from about 85% down to about 25%. So again, another big decrease. And then this other chart here is people living on less than $1.90 a day. Anyways, in recent years, there's also been a big decrease there. So what this is showing is that even around the world, even though we still know there is extreme poverty in certain parts of the world, over the long term, there has been this long-term decrease in the level of poverty over the last couple of centuries. So it seems like in the world society as a whole, we're making some progress towards eradicating poverty. Okay, that's it for chapter 14. Talk to you later.